At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Hello everyone and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Today I have two individuals with peculiar experience and also insights into psychedelic therapy. We have Sam Bloomfield, who's one of the directors of PsyEdu, and he's a psychotherapist, and he'll explain in a minute what PsyEdu is, if you don't know, because I want you to get it exactly right, but it's very pioneering. And we have Eddie Jacobs, who's now Dr. Eddie Jacobs, who rose to fame as I think probably the first person in the UK to do a PhD on the ethics of psychedelics. Is that right, Eddie?
That's technically correct, but it's the first person in the world.
That's it.
Although I must say, there are other people rushing up ahead, so that's an accolade I'll only have for another 2 years. So I really need to make the most of it.
Well, I'm going to give you a little plug, Eddie. I'm going to give you a little plug. Not only, did you raise your own money to do this, really interesting, the work you have done, which you'll share with us, but I'll also point out what you've just told me, that you're currently unemployed. So if anyone wants a talented, very talented postdoc to work in this arena, get in touch with him directly, or if you can't find him, you can certainly find me, and I will make sure I get to him, because he's a talent we don't want to waste, and we want to maximize. So good luck to you, and congratulations on getting your PhD, because I know how hard that is. I would never want to do that again. Anyway, that's enough of Eddie. Let's move on to Sam. So tell us a bit more about you, Sam, because I'm not sure people have met you so much as I have Eddie.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So PsyEdu is a company that we started a few years ago to educate health professionals, so both in mental health and physical health professions, on psychedelic practice. So part of our remit was around harm reduction. Other aspects of it is to try and kind of push the mainstream into taking psychedelics more seriously in terms of their capacities to support well-being, and to try and change the kind of the narrative, if you like, around psychedelics from being something dangerous or outlawed to being something potentially useful. Most of my day job is as a psychotherapist and supervisor. So I work with teenagers. I work with do a lot of group psychotherapy and also a lot of clinical supervision and supervision for youth teams. So working with where social breakdown has led to, say, more and more teenagers or young people who are disenfranchised from society. That also kind of feeds back to my interest in working with the other directors and tutors at PsyEdu.
Well, tell us a bit more about your training course, because it's definitely the first in the UK and maybe still the only one, isn't it? But share with us the success and the vision. Yeah.
Yes, I guess, we share something there, Eddie. It's lovely to share this platform with you as well.
Likewise.
Thanks. Yeah, we offer a 1-year certificate program, which is geared toward kind of first level degree in terms of kind of academic standing, with 250 hours of content and 80 plus hours of live teaching over a year. And we're heading into our third cohort. So we practiced it on ourselves. We didn't mess it up too badly. And so we have the wonderful Duncan Still, who you've had on this program, as our academic director.
But you've also, apart from having the group, I think I've spoken to at least 2 of your cohorts, and they've been, enthusiastic, intelligent, very knowledgeable and persuasive individuals, which is fantastic. But the other thing you do is you take some of them abroad to have an experience, which is, again, I think necessary, but also really impressive. So just tell us about what you actually do so people can see the scale of your achievements.
Yeah, thanks. So we work as retreat organizers and facilitators through different organizations, working on a 6-day retreat model generally, where people might choose to take a lower dose initially to kind of discover the lay of the land. Very much indebted to Dr. James Hawkins for this kind of approach. He developed an organization called PHP, which is we could say is an offshoot from the Scottish Psychedelic Society. And so we have this kind of program of we suggest a low dose and then a higher dose. And there's an orientation, preparation, and then integration package, which is differentiated, including to looking at whether or not if people are a little bit more vulnerable, do they need to really have an extended sense of or extended kind of therapeutic input post-retreat. And yeah, it's been that part is kind of like a roller coaster ride, really. And as those of you who have understanding of psychedelics well know, the psychedelic seems to be in charge and no one else really knows which way it's going.
But just to be absolutely clear, you go to the Netherlands, I believe, and I presume you use truffles because they're legal there.
Yeah.
And are you the therapist, or do you work with Dutch experts as well?
Yeah. So the way that we're employed with that is as facilitators. So we sign a contract to specifically not be therapists because the Dutch wouldn't like that legally. So we go there as facilitators to support someone who's deciding to both buy the truffles and ingest them. And one of the lovely things about working in Holland is that they only have, or at least a couple of years ago when I last checked, they only have 2 wholesalers of truffles and they are regulated to food standards. So we know that people are not going to get sick, basically. And we can, although the amounts of psilocybin in the truffle packs vary, we have processes in order to try and even that out.
Well, no big negative so far, and a lot of individuals coming back pleased that they're engaging in your training course. Is the impression I get from talking to them.
Yeah, there's been a lot of word of mouth from the retreats of people who were lucky enough or privileged enough to have between, say, 1,000 and 3,000 to spend. We do try and have So Dr. Duncan Still, for example, he is running a retreat, again, not as a doctor, but as a facilitator soon. And they've got a philanthropist on board to try and bring more equity of access so people can access that even if they have £1,000 rather than £3,000. But yeah, people come back, they report very positive experiences. We've had turnaround experiences to do with addiction, both with alcoholism and with cannabis addiction, or the psychology of cannabis addiction. And we've also explore then as an education company, kind of the overall landscape of that. So what does this mean for health professionals? So what about the health professional who doesn't want to be involved in retreat facilitation, but perhaps would like to go into research or into working on a trial, or just support clients who are choosing either legally or illegally to access psychedelics? Those people need support. So that's what we're set up to provide, hopefully, education in that area.
Definitely needed, as it's definitely a growing area. So, Eddie, tell us what you did in your PhD.
So the very reason that I wound up doing a PhD in ethics really comes from my time at the late Amanda Fielding's Beckley Foundation, where I was working, in fact, with your podcast producer, James, in 2018.
Right.
And as you will remember, Dave, 2018, it really felt like the field was high itself. And I think to some extent I'd drunk the Kool-Aid, like we're getting these big effect sizes. These drugs have been used for hundreds of years. We should license them now, et cetera, et cetera. And I came across a piece by Tahsin Noorani, who's an anthropologist who was working at Hopkins. He did a qualitative study of their tobacco addiction trial.
Yeah.
And it just really blew me away that for so many of these participants, the least important thing that happened for them was that they stopped smoking, which really struck me as quite bizarre. They're like, you want to quit smoking badly enough to take part in this experimental trial, and then 4, 6, 12 months later, the least important part of that is that you're not smoking, you're loving your connection to your family, to nature, the fact that you're reconnecting with your values, like all this great stuff that we now know, recognize as fairly commonplace. And like, psychedelics aren't the first drug that have positive off-target effects, right? But it's striking how many people value them. And so it was at that time I was looking at the psychedelic field, and, there wasn't much like ethical inquiry at all. Like, there were very few people kind of kicking the tires pre-licensing to see like, okay, how is this going to work? And so I decided to spend a few years talking to patients, participants in some of these clinical trials to get a sense of like what their experience was like over and above what gets reported, like in the clinical trial papers, with the exciting effect sizes and the vibrancy and the excitement.
Sounds like what you found was more exciting.
Well, I'm glad that you think so, Dave, because you were actually co-author on one of the papers that came out of this. So one of the things that struck me speaking with my participants is just the high rate at which participants who've tried psilocybin in a trial context, done particularly well, or sometimes didn't do well, that they will go and seek to take psilocybin in and of under their own steam. And of course, like there's a place for talking about participant autonomy here. Like, to some extent, researchers can't control everything that research participants do after their trial involvement. So I think it's probably somewhere between 15 and 30% of trial participants that do this. And if you were on an IRB, like an ethics review board, and you were reviewing an application of like a new trial that some researchers in your university wanted to do, and they said, well, 15 to 30% of people that take this intervention go off to do something risky or illegal. Like, as an IRB, you would want to see some mitigation of some form about that. Yeah, and I think psychedelic trials, as I think maybe the three of us in the room will agree, operate in this weird sort of hybrid status. Like, they're a drug trial, but they're also a psychotherapy trial.
Yeah, I just wanted both. Yeah, if you were on that board, you'd be thinking, kind of, we might be leading people toward activity which is illegal. At the same time, you'd be thinking, well, hold on a minute, like, this was incredibly successful because people are going to do this because they felt that it's had such a profound effect on them. So would it be ethical not to research it?
Yeah, 100% for sure. But yeah, I think research teams, the IRBs, the sponsors do I think need to acknowledge that this is a reality of people that take psychedelics. Like, it seems to go well. And unlike other investigational drugs, like, there isn't an illegal access route to a gene therapy or to a chemotherapy that's working particularly well. But like the decision points that psychedelic trial participants can take are quite different. Like, it can be very rational if you've had treatment-resistant depression for 20 years. None of the psychopharmacology has worked. None of the therapy has worked. Maybe you get one dose of psilocybin and you get 6 months where the weight is lifted, like you are engaging with your life how you want to again. And then, as often happens, like, the effects recede. You're leaving participants like that in a very invidious position. Is it, am I going to obey the law and be depressed for another 10, 15 years until this treatment is licensed? Or am I going to break the law in pursuit of a treatment that I know is good for my own health?
Or you have to go and pay a lot of money to go to a retreat company that, more or less like an organization of facilitators or whatever, to try and replicate that. But you have to go abroad. 100%. So that's difficult.
Yeah, and it's fine if you have the means to go abroad. Yeah. And it's great that PsyEdu are having these discounted participation rates for people that don't have the means. But like a core tenet of research ethics is that we should be kind of fairly dividing the benefits of research participation, but also the risks. And if you look at this cohort of psychedelic trial participants who decide, I need to access this, it's not a very fair distribution if wealthier participants can go and do it in relatively safe places. But if you happen to be like lower socioeconomic status, and we know that lower socioeconomic status is where like a high degree of mental ill health is, it's really not fair that we're leaving some participant groups without the options that other participant groups have.
Well, no, this is obviously, a hugely important question, which maybe we come back to that in just a minute. But I just want to emphasize that I think the IRBs would tend to be more concerned that individuals are becoming addicted. They would tend to fear, and I think regulators, like, the FDA have clearly shown a prejudice that any reuse is addiction rather than achieving the goal that they achieved months or years before, and then are trying to reinstate. I mean, and I think that would be my arguments, and in fact that is an argument I have made in relation to the MDMA trials, where they was one of the FDA criticisms was that they hadn't proved it wasn't addictive. I mean, I don't think you need to do that, frankly, but you seem to do for these drugs because their illegality in part was predicated on this false notion that they were addictive. I mean, I don't know why they would comment on that.
And actually, and classical psychedelics are more anti-addictive, aren't they? Or at least in my experience. I mean, we really don't want to go there again. I remember one experience in the Netherlands where I had a kind of idiosyncratic reaction where I was throwing up, and I said to one of my friends there, I said, I can't believe anyone, including me, chose to do this. But actually, some of the positive effects that I experienced, afterwards were, as Eddie has said, of really long-lasting duration, of a sense of connection with family, and a kind of the importance of, well, for me at least, of having meaningful work. That life can take on a kind of an extra sense of meaning and lead to a shift of ontology that would be good to talk about the ethics of that shift of ontology, as in, is the person who chooses to go the same person after the experience? That, that's an interesting...
Yeah. I'm not sure presenting ontological concepts to IRBs is going to be that easy. Maybe we could turn that into a slightly, easier language. Okay, so there are two really important things that you've brought up here I want to explore with both of you, because you've thought a lot about them. So why don't we start with equity then? Why don't we start, how do we resolve equity? I mean, I don't know, is it basically we got to get it through so the NHS will prescribe? Is that really the only way?
Sure. So that's going to be like a key element of equity, right? At least as psychedelic therapy manifests in the UK. And I suppose the way you frame that question, Dave, reminds me of how, like, a lot of the rooms, a lot of the tables that I'm part of that are trying to discuss how psychedelics will look, be it in the UK or elsewhere, is that a lot of the time ethics really comes down to politics. Like, because you can make really solid arguments, firstly, about the need for equitable systems for distribution of healthcare, and of course, like, what is the best way to engage with Indigenous communities. Like, you can think long and hard about these things, but the issue is, like, we don't really have, certainly in the UK, the kind of regulatory flex and muscle to specify things like, you know what, you need to give every fifth psychedelic treatment pro bono to someone that can't afford it. Like, I think the much more tangible way of going forward with that is trying to generate buy-in from users. There are like already a couple of bodies within the UK that are trying to position themselves as the voice of the psychedelic industry in the UK. And I think whoever's got the best ethics code is who I'm backing in that race. I've yet to decide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the driving senses for me being involved in this. Generally I'm quite risk averse, and I work with teenagers and children. I think, well, I don't want to be involved in the psychedelic field, but the whole field or the whole area of drug policy is leading to so many different harms to so many different people, and particularly children, in relation to successful criminal practice against drug dealers, which then leads to, as I understand it, the grooming of child drug dealers, and then we have the county line. So I think in terms of kind of equity, there's a really strong argument that we need to change the legal landscape and make drugs regulated in order to make it safer for everybody, including the people who decide not to take psychedelics or any other form of drug. So absolutely, I'm really, fully agreed with what Eddie has said. How do we do it? How do we change the political landscape? I know that PsyEdu, that drug science has been involved in setting up, is already having those conversations about trying to get this into the political meal train, if you like. But that's very challenging because, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that the word ethic in Greek relates to character and habit, etymologically speaking. So there's a habit or a moral value that doesn't allow science to shift public opinion and or the legal landscape. So we have a habit of ethics which is unethical in a sense. Yeah. And we're in that dynamic.
Yeah. To my mind, the shift has got to come from patients or users or clients, from people who have fortuitously or after efforts found healing through working with you or other groups, and a campaigning. When I look at what's in the US, it's the population vote in Oregon and Colorado that has actually made things change. What I find intriguing is, perhaps not so much Oregon, but maybe not even Colorado, but the fact that the US are leading us in terms of having a population consensus. Is it because we have such a constricted media here, we can't have this more broad dialogue, looking for to our health? I mean, are you pessimistic? I don't know how you cope with the media, both of you.
Well, I would push back a little bit there, Dave, when you say the US has a stronger consensus than the UK. I will cast your mind back to 2021, which I think is when we first met. And Drug Science very kindly gave me some money to run a YouGov poll on, what are the British public's attitudes to psilocybin therapy. And wow, we were really surprised. I wasn't hoping for above 50% on that, but every question that we asked in every demographic, it was comfortably above 50%. So I had kind of hoped that, we've got the scientific arguments. No one in Parliament is really standing up and full-chestedly arguing against reforms like this. And we know that, at least as of 4 years ago, the public were well in favour of this. So but there is whatever the public is, go on.
The public had a voice to you. Mm-hmm. They answered the questions. Mm-hmm. But the government hasn't responded. The previous government hasn't. This one hasn't. The media haven't. And that, so in a sense, I suppose, the public have been disenfranchised. They are being disenfranchised for political reasons, I think, and maybe moral. Yeah, the drug laws in Britain are archaic and getting worse as we've over the last couple of decades. Yeah, they don't reflect. So how do we get the UK public to force the politicians to change? And if individual political parties don't take up the cause, there is no change. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I find it rather disturbing that that because your data suggests there should be political merit or value in recommending change. But maybe it's our two-party system. Maybe it's the fact that we don't like admitting we were wrong on the drug laws. We don't have the political flexibility that America has, I suppose, and that's why we have seen them change from cannabis and recreational cannabis, medical cannabis, and now on psychedelics. And I find that sad because there's no question. The UK has had quite a role in both the historic development of psychedelics and the recent research we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I understand that much of the research is happening in the UK.
Well, we pioneered it, absolutely. But now most of it's happening outside the UK. And that's partly because, right. I mean, we got one grant from the government in 2012, and we got the next grant we got from the government, despite putting in lots of grant applications, it was last year. So it's a sort of 10-year cycle of them when, we lots of other companies.
So is it then the kind of federalist political system in America that's enabling that, and whereas our system and our politics are really quite archaic in a sense. I mean, there is obviously change afoot, isn't there? There's a lot going on between the Conservatives and Reform, and our Reform are becoming the new Conservatives, which is a real, which is a kind of wonderful irony if it does happen, because conserve means to kind of keep things the same, and Reform means, no, we got to change everything. But now so there's a strange loop happening there.
Well, I don't know what Reform think about. So they actually might be somewhat more radical than the Conservatives. Labour are hugely disappointing, but that perhaps not surprising, because you have a Prime Minister who's probably locked up more people for drug crimes than any British Prime Minister, maybe any other head of government. But maybe we can't solve that problem about equity. But
well, I think there's something about the role of education, isn't there? That, not to try and market PsyEdu, but it's also it's about changing people's minds who are in places of professional responsibility to try and change the framing of the debate, isn't it? That hopefully then, if Parliament say, if for example, I mean, I guess that there are also MPs whose families have probably had really positive experiences, hopefully. There's something about kind of holding on to the reins of this kind of psychedelic, what has been called a renaissance, but that's really a kind of, I don't like that term myself, but holding on to the reins of things to really try and keep an eye on what is really ethical practice, to try and encourage the kind of amount of underground use of drugs, to move toward actually, can you ask your GP for this? So rather than, I mean, I had a remarkable statistic quoted to me by Ben Sessa recently at a party I happened to bump into him at, and I really enjoyed him, actually. I thought he was a really, it was a great conversation given the difficulty that he was in at that point. And he said, Sam, do you know how many doses of MDMA are happening in the UK every weekend? And I said, no, I really have no idea. He said 250,000 recreational doses. So, we're faced with a population, as you say, who are broadly positive in terms of the therapeutic application of psychedelics. We've got a lot of underground or recreational drug use that is going on. Can we please shift this toward GPs actually being able to say, hey, you know what, you're having a bit of a hard time. There's a new treatment that you might benefit from, but you will need some therapy.
I think the GP word is hugely important here, because the actual total, utter failure to have medical cannabis rolled out in this country is down to the more senior consultants. The decision was made, whether deliberately or accidentally, to limit it to specialists, limit prescribing to specialists. And specialists generally are old white men like me who spent their years researching something other than medical cannabis and don't want to discover that they don't know enough about it to prescribe it. So we're campaigning strongly to try to get primary care to have access to medical cannabis. And I completely agree with you. They should be the gatekeepers, or at least the facilitators of access to psychedelic therapy sooner than later. But that may be, so if we can persuade the chief medical officer to accept that psychedelics and medicines like Australia and the Czech Republic and New Zealand seem to have done, then we need to make sure the equity comes across the different medical professions, not as well as the different, to access it for people with different social status.
Chief medical officer aside, where do you think the other pressure points that we should be leveraging to try and get buy-in from? What's the Royal College of Psychiatrists' position on all this at the moment?
Well, I wish I knew. The answer is, I don't know that they do have a position. I do know that they are looking for a position, but they are not. Yeah, they tend not to be. Unfortunately, they don't lead. They're defensive. They're very scared of off-label prescribing.
Yeah, Dave, just to speak to that as well in terms of the kind of regulatory bodies of psychotherapy. So the largest one is BACP, and Duncan, so Dr. Duncan Still and I, we recently wrote an article which was which was kind of checked over by the editor of one of their journals, the Thresholds Journal, and it didn't pass through ethical review. And we tried to find out why, because there are many counsellors having to deal with people who've been in altered states of consciousness, who might well go into primary care and be misdiagnosed because of a clinician doesn't understand the psychedelic landscape and so on. And we couldn't get an article in there to say why we were educating health professionals, particularly in that relation, kind of counsellors, in understanding what psychedelics do and what different kind of effects they might have, and what in terms of screening might need to happen. So if you have a client coming to you saying, hey, I'm going off on the weekend for an ayahuasca retreat, you might want to say to them, oh, hold on a minute, has anyone screened you for that? And they might say no, and you say, oh, be careful. You'd have thought that would be a primary ethical concern of large governing bodies of counsellors and
it's all predicated on the fact it's illegal. There's a fear that harm reduction, it's only 5 years ago that we were allowed to, maybe less, that the Home Office allowed the term harm reduction to be in any government report, and it was seen that harm reduction was actually encouraging use. It was this perverse idea that we can prohibit drug use to to reduce harm. It's just so outmoded, but it's ingrained in the government and civil service. It's really difficult to change. And it may be we can't change it. One of the things I'd like to talk to you both about now is if psychedelics cannot get to the people that need them through the medical route, and I suspect they won't, what's the best other route? So, Eddie, do you want to talk about that? Or do you think that's unethical?
So actually, I will say that I think it's hugely ethical to recognize the legitimacy of a huge range of uses for psychedelics. Like the clinical psychedelic research is really picking up now and it's getting a lot of attention. But at every point since psychedelics started being used, right through to the present moment, onwards to the last moment that psychedelics are going to be used, clinical use is going to be the minority, like the small minority. And it's important that we can have like sober, serious ethical analysis about all the psychedelic use for self-development or your own spirituality or as part of an indigenous ritual practice, or if you just want to use them to have fun. All that, I think, is like responding to a legitimate set of human needs, wishes. And you might argue that if we can't medicalize psychedelics, frankly, that would suck because there's a lot of benefit that I think they can do in the medical system. But there are plenty of other benefits that people are accessing outside of these contexts. So you asked which is the best way for people to get access to psychedelics. That really depends on why you want to use psychedelics. Like I imagine that it will be retreat settings like the ones Sam's involved in that are possibly the best for a therapeutic, if not clinical use. And of course, Sam, as you mentioned, you've got to kind of dance quite carefully of the boundaries of the language there. But if we're not going to medicalize these things, it would be solidly good to decriminalize them for reasons that I suspect you both agree with anyway. And perhaps we don't need to go on to at length.
Yes, thanks, Eddie and Dave. Yes, where do we? It's quite hard not to end up with a sense of hopelessness, really, isn't it? Kind of like, oh no, how do we? Because of course, in terms of recreational use, you then have people who are kind of white and male and probably drive around in a new car. They're less likely to be stopped, and so they're more likely to be able to get in and pay a very exorbitant fee to go to a club where they can then enjoy themselves. And there's
I think that's right. The club's called Westminster, isn't it, for cocaine anyway?
So I hear. Yeah, that was a good report. What that one, wasn't it? And also I suppose that speaks to these other forms of drug use. Cocaine is renowned for making people very selfish and aggressive, and psychedelics, as Paul Stamets reminds us, can take someone from being slightly sort of domestically averse, let's say, if not violent, toward someone who actually really kind of prioritizes connection and conversation and a sense of, well, this isn't working. Should we try something else? Because, of course, psychedelics are used also in creativity. And I believe that trials suggest that support.
Well, absolutely. And I'd like to get onto that.
creative.
I mean, it seems I was struck from the study we did when we compared escitalopram, which is the gold standard, most selective SSRI antidepressant, with 2 doses of psilocybin. And I was struck. I wasn't surprised at all by the fact that psilocybin did better on almost all measures of depression, but I was surprised by the opposite, the very profound and greater impact on well-being of psilocybin in people who it didn't just lift depression; it also gave them a sense of being in control, being connected, of having better insights. And to my mind, that's going to give resilience. And I think building on the concepts that Stamets has come up with, and you've mentioned, we have a very disconnected society. And you could argue, maybe I would. I mean, see what you think, that this rise of particularly of youth mental illness, as it's called, is to a large extent a sense of disconnection and a very uncertain sense of where anything is going and where people stand. And psychedelics might well be a way of actually helping people work through that.
Thank you. And I think indigenous culture, sorry, Eddie, were you going to?
I want to hear about indigenous cultures, Sam.
Okay. Well, I think, indigenous, I mean, I like Vanessa de Oliveira's kind of defining of, or at least kind of understanding of society in terms of 2 different main modes of being, one of which is partnership and the other one is domination. And I think indigenous culture, as has survived aspects of domination, would point to this sense that of really trying to come into partnership and understanding the human development as requiring meaning and positive, resilience is about being able to imagine something else. And where we're stuck in a domination kind of paradigm, we're unlikely to be able to partner with, for example, these youth who are really struggling, particularly people with disabilities. I mean, they've been doubly disadvantaged in recent times, and particularly the disadvantaged who've, of course, in the pandemic became even more disadvantaged also. Well,
the pandemic did fragment society even more. I mean, even unnecessarily.
At the risk of skating over quite a lot of interesting material there, Sam, I want to jump back to this escitalopram comparison study you mentioned, Dave, because I agree with you. There's that forest plot hidden in the supplementary materials that I think speaks a world about the difference between psilocybin and escitalopram. Okay, so the primary measure of depression, it was no significant difference, which I think is no shame because we accept escitalopram as effective. But these other benefits that people get from psychedelics, the flourishing, the well-being, the feeling more connected to everything around you, it really pushes on quite fundamental questions about what do we want psychiatry to be? What is its aim and what is it for? There's a great thought piece by one of the early, I think, Hopkins patients, Rachel Peterson. She went on to do a fellowship at Harvard. She wrote the, I think, a very clickbaity title, but wonderful piece, Psilocybin Cured My Atheism or something. But a point she made in this piece is a discussion with a reporter, saying, oh, did it work? And she spoke about how bizarre a question that was. It was a 2D question being thrown into her newly 3-dimensional world. Yeah. She said, the depression 12 months later isn't smaller than it was before, but the space around it got bigger. And, she's just able to hold this relationship to her own suffering and to other people's suffering in this really importantly different and powerful way.
Just to say that's so exciting because the way you frame that, us therapists, we talk about mentalization, and we have done for many years, the sense of being able to think around an issue and to take different perspectives within oneself as being absolutely fundamental to developing as a human being. And we also have IFS, internal family systems therapy now, which is part of this movement toward a mosaic within each human being of personalities, and it's navigating those personalities in a healthy way that is a healthy self. And this is something, again, that psychedelics appear to develop in some way. So, yeah, just want to empower what you're saying, and please do carry on.
So one of my big fears is that there will be a few cases of psychosis or disturbed behavior which might lead to suicide or other harms to others, which will then be absolutely magnified in the press. I mean, I don't know if you've seen recently, I mean, there's this call to make ketamine a Class A drug because a couple of people, have died, in rather unfortunate circumstances. And I fear that this might happen with psychedelics, because I suspect, despite, I think Eddie's already pointed out that if the population are generally on side, I don't think the media are quiet. And that doesn't mean that they're in agreement. I think they're just holding back until they got something they can really go and kind of get their teeth into, something very critical. And I just want to ask both of you how we can work to minimize any kind of backlash and to make sure whenever we do this treatment, or where people engage with this experience, we can minimize harms. Who wants to start? Well, maybe Sam. That's probably something that you spend quite a lot of time thinking about, especially when you take people to the Netherlands and you've got to get them home again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how do we minimize a backlash? That's by asking, if not demanding, from retreat organizations that they have codes of conduct for their facilitators, that their facilitators are well educated, thoughtful, supervised human beings who are not taking risks, but potentially from financial points of view. I think retreat companies don't really earn much money, and that's problematic because they can cut corners in terms of developing facilitation teams that are really robust, supervision structures that are really robust, and also programs that are well beyond the retreat itself, both before and after. So and I'm not saying that that's a solution. It's still problematic in my view, which is another reason for trying to bring in equity of access. I think another aspect to that is to try and talk with and to the underground. There's an enormous amount of underground activity going on in the UK, and that is just risky. And it's more risky because it has to be done under the radar. And I just would really hope then that we're having conversations with policymakers to try and shift this to shift the media landscape toward, actually, people are doing this recreationally. Maybe there's nothing wrong with that. If they are, then we also need to be educating health professionals, and we need to be educating politicians in how to change the political landscape. If we get into a kind of positive or even idealistic frame, I would say also it's worth telling stories. For example, like I ride a motorbike, and people die on motorbikes, but no one's going to stop me from riding a motorbike and enjoying that, and even going out on track days, and enjoying that kind of.
I don't mind you doing that. Just don't ride horses, right?
Yeah, well, but apparently there is a statistic that horses are more dangerous to ride than motorbikes.
That's exactly right.
But yeah, it's like, in order to live a meaningful life, we need to take risks, and people do die of stuff. And in fact, at the end, we all die. Not to be, doom laden about it, but it's what we do in between.
No, we don't die. We just rearrange our atoms. But that's another question.
Well, yes.
I want to.
That sounds like a good podcast.
Can I? So the other area that's going to come under attack, and we've seen this. We saw this really quite viciously in relation to the FDA pre-panel assault on MAPS. Was therapists will abuse patients. Psychedelics patients are vulnerable; they're going to be abused. Now, I know both of you've thought about this, but I'm going to start with you, Eddie, because I know you considered that quite a lot. How do we reassure the world that this isn't going to happen, or how do we minimize the risk of happening?
Yeah, it's really tricky, and it's really tricky, I think, also to earnestly engage in this conversation, because it's very easy for your intent to get twisted when you say there is a non-zero rate of boundary violations and sexual abuse among psychotherapists, among psychiatrists, among any profession that takes care of vulnerable people.
I think gynecology which is not the highest rate of being struck off, but that. But we don't.
Oh, I can believe
you
that.
Carry on. Sorry, I should have listened.
Yeah, and so like aiming for a 0% rate of this happening
Exactly.
is never going to be achievable. Like, I mean, we can aim towards that consistently, but there needs to be perhaps a little bit of realism about what's done. One thing that I don't think has been discussed very much in the literature, but I heard Rob Shervers at Groningen mention, was there is probably a role for a greater degree of like selection bottlenecking on the part of senior therapists to who should be encouraged and brought on to train to do this sort of work. Because is it Glenn Gabbard, I think, has done a fair bit of research on like what are the characteristics, like vulnerable narcissism, I remember, is one of them, on the part of therapists who tend to go on to abuse these patients. I guess another thing that's really not being done that perhaps should be done more widely is like co-supervision groups and maybe like peer-reviewed articles of near misses, of like ethical vagueness, because there is in that clinic room with psychedelics. Like, it's a strange energy to be in there, and we speak all the time about them being boundary dissolving and things get weird. So obviously, like, code of ethics is a non-negotiable part of it. But, you know, I'm fairly sure MAPS had a code of ethics when the violation up in Canada on that island happened. Like, it needs to be just as much about driving a culture of ethics, you know, where people can discuss things they weren't sure about. And as much as there need to be structures for raising issues and punishing violators, also, I think a beneficial thing would be recognizing that not all violations need to be responded to with casting someone out of the community. Because if you make it the case that practitioners think that any mention of maybe they took a misstep somewhere that they regret, if any discussion of that is led with exclusion permanently from the community, that is not going to foster a community of open conversation. And
that's the general principle of medical errors, medical negligence, which of course flounders when you have litigation-based decision-making like we do in this country and in the States. It is an issue. Let me get back to Sam. How do you work through this with your trainees, students?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think with an ongoing curiosity of how do we operate in this space. So we obviously with the PsyEdu course, we're only taking qualified practitioners, but then what does that mean? The research is interesting. The research that I've come across, but do tell me if I'm wrong with it, is that the most dangerous time for people in our careers is at the beginning and at the end. So we can be very experienced and qualified and still make grave errors of judgment, and we can also, of course, be unqualified, you know, as in just having qualified, and also then make errors of practice just because we haven't developed the experience. Also, there's some really interesting research. I think it's from 1988, and it's Capuana et al. It's an American piece of research, and it suggests that 70, roughly, I think, from memory, 70% of mental health practitioners in the States agreed in an anonymous survey that they developed sexual feelings towards their clients. That's male practitioners, and female practitioners, it was a slightly less. I think it's around 40 or 50, something like that percent. So, and one of the interesting things about psychedelics that we've already referenced in our conversation is that they create or support a psyche in creating more space. So more space to be able to be honest with oneself about different drivers to different types of behaviors. So rather than kind of shutting down again, or you know, this conversation, this really we need to think about that we have substances which can support people to become more mentally self-aware, develop the capacity for mentalization, develop their capacity to have different conversations between different aspects of within themselves. And that makes for better practitioners and safer facilitators, and also might actually have some effect on, that was it. The Capuana research was that they'd also acted on the feeling. So they may not have actually been caught, or they may not have done it badly enough, but they had acted on those feelings. So actually, psychedelics can be part of the answer, as well as flagging up a problem that is quite endemic.
Well, it's endemic,
practice.
yes. Whether it's medical or psychological therapies, I mean, it's not just doctors. I think it's what I would also say that. Well, guys, it's been fantastic. We're getting nearly to the hour, so I think it's important that I let each of you say something, if you want to, that you haven't had a chance to say, because we haven't gone in the right direction. So Eddie, is there anything, last comment you want to make?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to take this opportunity to give a plug for www.hope-statement.com. So one of the things I've been doing over the course of the PhD is trying to get psychedelic ethics established as a field. Like, we set up a small research center, we've hosted some events, but one of the things I'm proudest of is this Hopkins-Oxford Psychedelic Ethics Consensus Statement, which is at hope-statement.com. Well, the idea of this statement is psychedelic science, it's very new, we're only just beginning, and so psychedelic ethics really needs to hit the ground running. And this is the product of 30 people, psychedelic scientists, ethicists, indigenous scholars, psychiatrists, a couple of entrepreneurs too, to try and get together what can we agree on at this point. But, ethics isn't the preserve of the experts. We really want feedback on this. We've translated it into 6 languages, and ethics is like an ongoing conversation. And I kind of want to hear what your listeners' takes are.
Well, that's an invitation to the listeners, and I'm very happy if you want to. You can either email me, because you know my email, d.nut@imperial.ac.uk, or you can email. I don't know, what email are you still using, Eddie? Have you still got the Oxford one, or have you got a new one?
I'm now at eddie@psychedelicethics.com.
Okay, and we'll put that up on the website as well. And Sam, last word over to you.
Yes, thanks. Well, I mean, I just really want to plug Eddie's plug, really. I mean, it's fantastic. I think this is really what's needed in the space. We created a code of conduct. We looked at a variety of different ones, and we did a lot of work, including with ex-students of ours, to try and so one of the things we've done with Bristol Medical School doctor students, for example, is we've given them our code of conduct and said, tell us about this. Like, what about, so we're trying to really to introduce, I think, which is also what Eddie is trying to do, a sense of ethics is about collaboration. It's about getting all the voices in the space, and particularly those voices that are not in a political space, and empowering them. It's about thinking about human needs. It's about becoming emotionally intelligent and literate. It's about thinking about the habits, if ethics relates to habits, thinking about the habits that we've had and have that don't serve us, and how we can move that conversation toward habits that serve the whole of humanity, not just certain individuals within it, and particularly that keep the vulnerable safe.
That's a fantastic statement on which to end. Thank you both, and I look forward to working with you both in the future, especially you, Sam, since we're actually trying to facilitate a collaboration with drug science and with PsychEdu. So thank you both again.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Eddie. Great to speak with you both.
Likewise.